Before we begin, as it's tradition with the History Lab, I'll just take a minute to promote our upcoming events and calls for papers. So first and foremost, it's my pleasure to share with you the annual call for papers for our History Lab conference. The conference will take place virtually on Tuesday, the 18th of July, 2023, and invites abstract submissions for traditional 20-minute papers alongside shorter 5 to 10-minute lightning talks. Some information about this should be making its way into the Zoom chat for you to look at some point, and I will be circulating more information on our social media outlets tomorrow. And when we submit the next newsletter, it will be coming out in there as well. It's also my pleasure to reveal the details for the first of our History Lab seminars. Our first seminar is entitled The Reception of the European Public Law and Imperial Competition in Late 19th Century Ottoman Albania, and is taking place online on Thursday, the 3rd of November. We don't currently have a registration link for this, but we will be getting one very soon. So at the minute, it's a save the date. And again, this will be going up on our social media outlets and newsletter very soon, along with the other seminars, which are all fantastic. The last thing that I want to share with you all is the new membership form that we've recently created and put out for History Lab people. So if you're not currently a member of the History Lab, we'd be really grateful if you could join us. It really helps us get an idea of who is within the postgraduate community at the minute. We like to work out who's self-funded and who's funded so that we can support people from different demographics in various ways. And it's with the help of members of the History Lab that we are able to put on events like the one that we're doing tonight. So with that, we will crack on with the first of our talks, which is by me. So let me just see if I can share my screen. And again, I'll see if I can get some reassurance off somebody that they can see that. Yeah, perfect. So the first of today's talks is rather aptly titled Getting Started. There is, of course, no right or wrong way to get started with a PhD or similar postgraduate research degrees. There are, however, several things that you can do to make the process less overwhelming and easier to approach. So I'll be using the next 10 minutes to outline just a few of these. So it's worth mentioning that I'm now a fourth-year PhD student, so this is after a few years of reflecting on the experience. And I do also work as a representative with PhD students that are just moving into the field. So I'm able to give them advice and sort of look at different experiences. But this is not by any means a prescriptive thing. It's more of our advice as History Lab committee members and other PhD students. So that's my little disclaimer. So the first and probably the most important piece of advice you'll be given when starting a research degree is to be flexible. So by this, we mean be prepared for your project to change. Almost nothing that you wrote in your initial application is set in stone, and this is largely a good thing. When you start a research degree, it's likely to be a good few months, or in some cases a year, since you wrote your initial proposal. I know for me, I started writing mine in probably November, December, and then I started my programme in September. So it was a good 9 or 10 months before I went back and looked at it again because I was so focused on doing my master's. For those of you who have already had your first supervisions and meetings with advisors, you'll likely have been told to revisit your proposal or have discussed it with them in a meeting. And if you haven't, I would sort of encourage you to have those discussions with your supervisors. And it's also just worth revisiting your initial application and thinking about your current framework if that's something that you've not done yet. It's important to mention here that you don't have to change anything, and we're not encouraging you to go straight into changing anything. What we are suggesting is that you should be open to adapting any aspect of your initial proposal in light of any new historiographical developments, source discoveries, or your own thoughts and feelings. I know for a fact if I'd have started my PhD a year later, it would sound a lot different because mine is on epidemic disease and I started the year before COVID. So I think my proposal would look very different if I was submitting it a year later. So to give an example from my own proposal, I revisited mine fairly early on and decided I had way too many case studies for my own liking. So I actually started off with 16 case studies of different places that had the plague in England, which was a vast amount of case studies to try and cover in 3 to 4 years. I can see Darren nodding. Yeah, I put too much pressure on myself there. I think I'd proposed way too much than I was capable of achieving in the 3 to 4 year period. And I wanted to focus more on the case studies that I was most interested in. I also expanded the temporal scope of my project fairly early on after I discovered that there were loads of primary sources of interest in 16th and 18th centuries as well as the 17th century. So that's something that's worth thinking about as well. You are well within your right to expand or narrow the temporal and geographical scope of your projects. The one thing to make sure you do is discuss any changes early on with your supervisors, but don't be afraid of change. And remember, you don't have to go ahead and change anything to begin with, but it's always worth being open to it. So I think that's one of the most important things to take away from what I'm saying. When you start your PhD, you have a lot more time to experiment and sort of fiddle around with the things that you're interested in that you probably didn't have time to do when you're working, studying for another degree. So that's just something that I think is fundamentally very important when starting the PhD. The second piece of advice for getting started with your research is to get to know other people. And that's something that I've been trying to encourage everyone to do as we've come into the call today. As you've probably heard, be it from Twitter or further afield, doing a research degree can be quite an isolating experience. But if you get started early with networking, this definitely doesn't have to be the case. Get to know other people within your departments and further afield. So this refers to academic staff members, admin staff members as well. You'll tend to find at a lot of universities that admin staff members have also done PhDs, which is quite interesting. And you tend to find people that have really similar research interests to you. And it's also about networking with fellow researchers at your university as well. And then will also be other people working on different time periods and geographies who share similar research interests who might be of benefit to you later down the line when it comes to organising departmental events and other activities which are great for CV building. So this is things like research clusters, for example, like the Centre for Medical Humanities or Centre for Early Modern Studies. Those are just things that are related to me, but there would be so many other examples for other people. If you haven't already got one, it's worth getting a Twitter account, and I'm hoping that most people will back me up with this. I'm not just saying that as the publicity officer, as some sort of promotional thing for the IHR. It has genuinely benefited me, and it's a fantastic way of networking, and I've discovered so many opportunities through social media. One thing you might not think of is that networking helps you to practice articulating your research as well to other people at an early stage in your research career. If you're not out there talking to other people, you're not necessarily sort of voicing your research in a more colloquial way, which is something that's really helpful and sort of simplifying your ideas. You can simply do that through messaging somebody on Twitter that you're talking to who's also doing a PhD, so that's really useful. And networking also essentially introduces you to new friends and support groups, so you can discover so many new readings and sources that you wouldn't have thought of or known about through people working in similar fields. And you'll probably find that most people are extremely willing and open to share sources that they've found or findings that they've got. And a lot of these connections are made through Twitter. I'm not working for Twitter. I'm not an ambassador for Twitter. I've just found it very, very helpful and thought I would share that. With this in mind, so my third piece of advice is to join committees and research groups. This way you can get to know more people with similar research interests. Again, there should, I hope, be research groups within your own institutions and further afield. And networks and committees also help to keep you up to date with upcoming events and calls for papers. It's at this point that I highly recommend you become a member of the History Lab network if you aren't already. So again, I think the link should be in the chat somewhere. So every month we release a newsletter with loads of new events, calls for papers, seminars and research opportunities that you might not otherwise know about. The same can be said for so many other niche research networks which focus on a particular time period, subject, geography, religion, culture, or methodology. If we receive anything, a call for paper from one of those, we tend to promote that in the group within our History Lab newsletter, but you can also find out lots of information about these more niche research networks through things like social media again. Tip number 4 is to make sure you sign up to any relevant training opportunities sooner rather than later. And this is quite an important point as well. So you should be eligible for both department and university-wide training for postgraduate researchers on a number of topics, including how to handle large Word documents, how to begin writing the thesis, how to store and manage data, and so on. And I think how to manage a big Word document is something that's overlooked by quite a lot of people. And especially people who are used to using Word documents for other things tend to come in and think, oh, I'm going to be absolutely fine handling sort of like a 300-page document. Never happens. Everyone stresses out as they get towards the end, as I've soon found out. So yeah, and I also highly recommend getting started early with paleography if this is applicable to your research, which I'm sure it is for many of you. So the IHR and the School of Advanced Studies both offer training days and resources aimed at people undertaking paleography as part of their research. Paleography can be challenging, and some sources will be easier than others to read, as I'm sure most of you will know, and most of my panelists will probably agree with that as well. Some hands are very, very evil and some are very kind. Get your hands on some photographs of manuscripts, be those from your own research or from an online repository, and practice transcribing them for at least an hour a week. As soon as you stop, you'll gradually lose the flow and the ability to transcribe with ease, in inverted commas, because I don't think it's necessarily ever easy, but you have to keep on top of these things. And definitely with paleography, keep it up, keep doing it, because otherwise it'll just disappear. It's one of those skills that's very temporary. It's there and then it's gone. So this one is rather self-explanatory, and this is my final tip, and this is get a diary. And it might seem quite state the obvious, and I do hope that everyone that's here today does have some sort of diary, but I will explain why. I have a physical diary and a digital one, and I keep them both updated so they're in sync with each other. Write everything in your diary, so your supervisions, your deadlines, your days off, and any events you want to attend. You'll find that your diary will fill up very quickly. So it's essential to keep on top of things and develop good time management skills. But it's also nice to look at your schedule and see that you have things coming up. This is something that I think is really important. So doing a PhD can definitely feel like a lonely process at times. When you realize you have so many events and opportunities coming up in your diary, you realize it's actually enjoyable, communal, and a productive experience. And that's something that I really valued when I had a diary to look at, and you can see like the different events where you know you're going to be meeting up with people. Whereas if you just have a completely blank slate, that's when you start to think, oh gosh, I actually really am having a lonely time. So that's it from me. That's my little presentation about getting started. So hopefully that gives people a bit of reassurance about the first steps. And I think I am now going to pass over to Wasim, who's going to be talking about relationships with supervisors. So over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. Hi, everyone. So my name is Wasim, and I'm a second year PhD student working on everyday politics during 1650s England. So I'm going to, as Claire says, spend the next 5 minutes or so discussing how to develop an efficient relationship with your supervisors. So the first point to make is that nearly every single relationship will be unique, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to navigate this. The relationship with your supervisor is in itself certainly quite unique to any other relationship that you may have. There are, however, some general rules of thumb that can be outlined. So naturally, there's some simple ways to ensure that you're able to establish a good relationship with your supervisor. Try and meet their deadlines to hand in work as long as they're reasonable. Reply promptly to emails, attend supervisory meetings, be polite and respectful both over email and in person, and just keep your supervisor in the loop essentially over the progress of your research. But one important point to make is that the relationship with your supervisor is a two-way street, and the terms of it shouldn't be purely dictated by them. Of course, your supervisor may have a preferred way of doing things, but despite the power imbalance, you have a right to voice your own opinions and to be able to negotiate the terms of the relationship. For instance, if your supervisor is someone who prefers to take a more hands-off approach when it comes to supervisory meetings and prefers to see you every few months, you have a right to tell them that you would, prefer to see them more often. So that brings me on to one of the key components of the supervisor-student relationship, meetings. So usually you would expect to see your supervisor more often in the first year of your PhD when you're getting to grips with things, and this then may become more infrequent as you progress further into your research. But as I say, the frequency of meetings should be something that is negotiated between you both. In some ways, it will depend on how both you and your supervisor operate. Your supervisor may be someone who is happy for you to email them very frequently and is good at responding. Others may be less good at this, but may try to balance this out by holding more frequent meetings. With that said, if your supervisor frequently ignores your emails or takes incredibly long to reply, let's say a week, then obviously it's something that you can flag up. So each supervisory meeting would be different. Some supervisors like their students to be constantly writing and may want you to send them work each time you see them and then spend some time discussing it. Others may prefer to have a more informal chat of what you've been up to and don't mind you sending them work more infrequently, especially in the first year or so of your PhD. So just let's speak briefly about what is your supervisor there for. So your supervisor is your primary source of guidance and someone who should be there to help you shape your project, provide constructive criticism on anything you send in, help you set deadlines, provide intellectual advice, and be someone to talk through ideas with. They are the person who will be your primary source for your methodology, your primary sources, your archives, and your secondary literature. They should be the first point of call for all things PhD related, essentially, and will be the person to turn to when problems arise over things such as whether the PhD is too big or too narrow, or if it needs to go in a new direction. They should also be there to support you in other PhD related stuff and be there to advise you on your career development, alongside things like presenting papers at seminars and conferences, writing journal articles, telling you which other academics you should reach out to, and things like that. Now, some may offer this advice quite openly, while others may be less proactive, but you can expect them to guide you with these things if you ask them. Ultimately, they're going to be the ones providing you with references when it comes to your future career, whether that's academic or non-academic. And in a sense, their reputation is also on the line. So no academic wants a reputation for being a poor supervisor. A brief note on what your supervisor is not there to do. Firstly, they're not there to write the PhD for you. Their primary role is advisory. They shouldn't be projecting their own ideas for a project onto you. By that, I mean, for instance, if your focus is on the 17th century transmission of news and your supervisor is currently researching something like religious iconoclasm, they shouldn't force you to switch directions. And it's obviously important to raise this with them if you start to feel this happening. Secondly, they're not there to keep 24/7 tabs on you. One of the great things about doing a PhD is that it provides a certain level of autonomy. And so your supervisor shouldn't be there micromanaging what you're getting up to. They should also not expect you to be working crazy amount of hours. Academia continues to be pretty terrible for chronic overwork and work-life balance, but you are allowed a life outside your PhD, and so you are well within your rights to tell your supervisor if they've set unreasonable deadlines that you're not able to meet. And the final point to make is that it's really dependent on the relationship you have with your supervisor over the extent to which you're able to sort of divulge your personal problems with them. Some you may be able to freely tell them in depth if you're having other problems. But what is key here, however, is that your supervisor does have a certain level of responsibility towards you. And if you are struggling, it is always probably best to tell them. They are human, and most will emphasize and should do what they can to provide you with supportive advice and help you in other ways, like pushing deadlines back or being proactive in helping you manage your workload during difficult times. A brief note that there are a number of different types of supervisory relationships, whether that might be multiple supervisors at the same institution, supervisors at different institutions, or supervisors in different disciplines. But each one of these will be slightly different, but in all cases, you should normally have a second supervisor, and in some cases, a third supervisor. And essentially, your second supervisor should really be there to complement your first supervisor's advice and be another point of contact should you require any additional guidance, and be someone you can send your work to and get feedback from. You'll probably meet your secondary supervisor less frequently, but again, you have a right to have a say on the frequency of meetings. In a lot of cases, it will so happen that your other supervisor may be of a different temperament. So you may be more comfortable discussing certain things with your second supervisor that you may be less comfortable discussing with your first supervisor. Given that you may be seeing them less, it may feel easier to discuss certain issues with another scholar who isn't, say, as involved as your first supervisor in the project. A little point on if problems do arise, which is a minority. Most of the time you'll get on super well with your supervisor and it'll be great. If a problem does arise with your supervisor, whether that be academic or something else, it's important to know that there are other people to turn to if you're unable to resolve the situation with the supervisor in the first instance. So the first point of call would be your graduate tutor, which every university should have, and you should have been introduced to them already. And you may also have a good relationship with other academics who you can trust and who you can turn to. And of course, you can also turn to your other supervisors as well. So I'm just going to finish this talk with 3 do's and 3 don'ts that you can take away from this. So do go to your supervisor for advice on your PhD, and do ask your supervisor for advice on sort of PhD related stuff and other sort of career related stuff, and do ensure that your opinion in the relationship with your supervisor is respected. Don't expect your supervisor to do all the work for you. Don't let your supervisor's vision overpower how you want your PhD to be, and don't allow your supervisor to dictate wholly the terms of the relationship. So yeah, that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Wasim. I think we are now moving on to Louise, who is joining us as a guest speaker today, going to be talking about archives. Thank you very much.
No problem. Let me just share my screen. Is this working okay, this mic? Because this headset is ridiculous and it's the first time I really used it in my life. Okay, I've got a dead formal like first slide here, but I did put all my information on there if you want to contact me at any point. Yeah, I guess Claire's probably really asked me this because I just really love archives, to be honest with you. It's the whole best part of a PhD. I'm not going to lie to you. It's the real reason I'm doing it is getting time to do more archival research. So yeah, I should probably introduce myself, obviously. I'm Louise. I do a collaborative PhD. So I work at the University of Leeds and the National Archives. I also used to work at the National Archives during the First World War centenary as well. So basically, I love the National Archives and can't escape them. And I work on British state provision of prosthetic limbs in the 2 world wars. I'm also special collections intern for the School of History at Leeds just now as well. So like, yeah, this love of archives is just always here. I don't really know where to start with this. I mean, the thing that I was looking most forward to when I started the PhD was getting back to the National Archives and getting to go and look at some old documents. Obviously, some of you will look at older stuff than others and more modern stuff, and also a lot of digital archives nowadays as well. I started my PhD, the first year was during the pandemic, so I couldn't get to the archive straight away, which was probably the worst first year of a PhD because, as I said, I was desperate to get there. But once you get there, it's great. And it did give me time to sort of prepare more for actually going to the archives. Now, I'm going to try not be too sort of patronizing with what I say. I'm also just teaching like my first year undergrads about archives just now as well. So I'm worried that I'll end up chatting to yous like I'm chatting to them. And I know that's a completely different level. And most of the sort of stuff you'll see on the slides that I've got here does relate to the National Archives, but actually their search engine is really good for every archive anyway. So it's probably for the best that's actually what I know. So yeah, I've used a sort of wide range of archives so far. In my thesis, I'm in my just started my 3rd year of the PhD. Obviously, mainly I work with National Archives, so I kind of have to, that's kind of forced upon me. So I guess I know where my main archive already was before I started the project. But that doesn't mean I'm not allowed to go and explore other archives as well. I've managed to get trips to places like Glamorgan Archives in Cardiff, use the British Newspaper Archives as well, which is a really handy online resource if you can actually access that. You might be able to get somebody to pay for it for you as well, which is great. I get the National Archives pay for my subscription for me, so that's really good. I also use museum collections. I know we're talking about archives, but museums also have a wide range of things that you can actually use in your research as well. Now, obviously, you can just go online, search an online catalogue. As I said, this is the National Archives online catalogue, but as you can see on the screen there, it does, if you search in there, you can search all archives or just what's at the National Archives. So that's actually really handy that if you're not sure where something is, then you can have a look on their catalogue, and it's great for that. It does mean that if you're looking for stuff just in the National Archives, be careful when you're actually looking, because sometimes you'll see an exciting result and it actually is in the middle of nowhere in a tiny archive, and it's not in London like you thought it was going to be. You don't have to be fancy when you're sort of creating lists of archives that you want to go to, or documents that you want to see. I mean, all of my lists of documents that I'm going to look at in an archive are just in a Word document. Make sure that you've got the reference, make sure you've got an idea of what it actually relates to and what archive it's actually from, but you don't have to worry about anything too high tech. I mean, obviously you can if that's your sort of like bag for doing things, but I think the only thing I have in a spreadsheet are all of my pension files from the First World War, because you could download that information from the National Archives catalogue and just made my life easier. I just went through and highlighted all the ones that I definitely wanted to see. So, I mean, yeah, don't worry about things like that. I mean, it can literally just be writing a list of things, but kind of have an idea of what you want to see before you're going to an archive. Don't just rock up. I mean, staff love to chat to researchers about what's there, but it does help if you've got an idea of what might be there in advance. A lot of archives expect you to kind of book in a place in advance as well, especially after the pandemic. You can't just walk in like you used to as easily and order documents on the day. So have a look at the sort of different archives as well and see what their rules are. I think that's a really important thing. Every archive has a different set of rules. I mean, most of them are sort of the same sort of things, obviously what you're allowed to take into the reading room and what you can't take in. So obviously pencils, not pens, no drinks, no food. No matter how much, you probably get starving halfway through and really want a cup of tea. Like, you're not allowed to have that next to a document, sadly. Some really tiny archives might try to like give you a cup of tea. I once went to one that was in a hospital. It was just this old man that was in charge of it. And he had like a few boxes of photos and things. He was just like, yeah, here's a slice of cake. And I was like, you can't do that. Like, we're literally, we're right next to like these like 100-year-old photographs. Like, I was very stressed out. I think that might be my training from working at the National Archives as well, but things like that. Obviously, when you're searching as well, there are sort of advanced search options to make your searches sort of easier and narrow it down a bit. A lot of these online catalogues and websites have online guides to researching through their what they hold as well. So like the National Archives, again, has lots of online guides to kind of tell you about the sort of different multitude of things that they hold there. So they're always worth utilising and helping you make your search a bit easier. And obviously advanced search can narrow down date range, etc. As I was saying, yeah, you can chat to staff. You can email staff in advance. A lot of archives have sort of online chat services or email addresses that you can email. And 9 times out of 10, staff are happy to try and help you as much as they can. And they'll know stuff that you would just never be able to find, because not everything's catalogued perfectly. I mean, I guess that's another sort of rule of going to the archive. You might not find what you want under a certain search term. You might have to play around with search terms a bit. Again, speak to staff. You might order something up and it might be a different document that you're given, because human error is a thing as well. Like, I've been in an archive, and as I said, I work on very much like 20th century stuff, and was given a document that was at least the 18th century. And I was like, well, it looks pretty. The handwriting I can't read because I'm used to sort of much more modern handwriting, but these things happen. Take it back. They'll give it back to you and they'll give you a new document. Again, other really sort of boring things that I probably need to cover about your trip to archives. I mean, obviously plan it all in advance, make sure you know where you're going, know the rules. I used to be one of those people that liked to take handwritten notes. Like, I was doing my master's and there wasn't as much pressure on you to like have looked at as many archives and documents and things. I like just doing that whole sort of old school pencil, paper, really like sort of reading the documents properly. If you've got time to do that during your PhD, then I'm very jealous of you, because I learned very, very quickly that I am taking photos of everything. And I mean, I suppose that's easier to take photos of things, come back to it. You can read it in your own time. Obviously, you can practice your paleography like Claire was saying as well. So there are sort of positives to that. Obviously, you need to back up your images. I've got a friend that keeps having files corrupt all the time from his like card on his camera, and that is stressing me out because he's not backing them up quickly enough. So that's very important, to make sure that you've got the images somewhere else other than just the source that you've taken them on. And obviously, you can use your phone as well. Make sure it's charged. If you're taking a camera, make sure you've got a spare camera battery. I've definitely fallen foul of that as well, especially in that last sort of hour of panic of taking photographs, and my camera batteries died. my phone battery's dying because I've been listening to music while I've been doing that, and it's just a nightmare. So make sure you're prepared for sort of technical things like that happening. Do check the policies for taking photos in archives as well. They're all different. Some archives don't care you take photos of everything. Some archives just won't let you take photos of certain things, or you need to get permission to take photos of certain things. And some archives will charge you for taking photos as well. So make sure you know that before you go. I mean, it's often not too extortionate, but you're still going to begrudge paying it. I mean, I know I always do when I go to a certain archive, but there's normally deals for a certain number of days as well. So just make sure you know of that before you go there. Also, just thinking in general, because I'm sitting in an office right now that is freezing, some archives are also very cold. So take a cardigan or a jumper or something to sort of keep you warm. Because also, if you're looking at those documents, it's all sort of temperature and climate controlled. So just, yeah, be careful about that. And also, I mean, I mentioned a bit about the sort of eating and drinking, but take breaks when you're there as well. I mean, again, you're not going to learn this from me because I'm very bad for going into the archive, knowing that I've got 3 days there and I've ordered a ridiculous number of documents. I don't know why they've let me do that. And I'll just work from like 9 till 5 and won't have a break and then leave and wonder why I feel so terrible. It's because I've not eaten or drank anything all day. I've not been to the loo. I've not moved, even just stretch for 5 minutes. Do something. I mean, even if it's not going to get food, but yeah, take breaks, look after yourself, because as much as it's the most fun thing, it can also be the most stressful thing of when you've ordered up or stuff's not been what you wanted, you've had to order up new stuff, or the stuff's better than you thought and there's loads of it, because you also probably don't know how big the file is going to be. We've also all done that. You've ordered some from the same record series previously and they've all been really thin files. Then you go to the next trip and they're all 600-page files, and surprise, you've now got to take photos of it all or look through it all somehow. Also, when you're searching on the catalogue, there are some sort of tips and tricks to doing that as well, which I didn't realise was a thing until I started working at the National Archives in like 2015. And it made my life so much easier. And these are sort of, most catalogues will kind of let you do a lot of these sort of like cheat codes to actually find things. A lot of them are very simple and sort of things you'd use on Google as well, but they do work on archive catalogues as well. And I'll leave that up for a second so you can actually have a read of it, but especially things like the asterisk with different spellings, because yeah, it depends what area you're looking at, depends who's done the cataloguing. We've all made typos anyway in life, so things like that are just very, very useful to actually know about. And I just thought I'd show some of the sort of like, again, I'm going to kind of showcasing the National Archives stuff here. Apart from that prosthetic leg, that's the Science Museum. We do not have anything as cool as that at TNA, unfortunately. But this is just sort of stuff that I look at as a sort of, I guess I am a modernist. But I mean, obviously you think the National Archives, I always think it's been this sort of very boring government-y archive, but there's sorts of loads of cool things. Are like this blueprint for a prosthetic foot. I look at a lot of sort of medical case files, so I have to look at doctors' handwriting, which is a whole different story compared to most handwriting as well. And the example sort of middle centre there isn't the worst I've seen, but there's also, you can tell there's been different doctors writing on that with different coloured pens, etc. But likewise, because I do look at sort of more modern stuff, I do get quite a lot of typed stuff as well, which is a godsend after you've been looking at all those patient notes all day. So yeah, have fun, try it if you can, look at a range of things. I mean, you never know what you're going to find as well, which is exciting. And I'll end with one last slide about you never know what you're going to find. I can't take credit for this initial find of this. It was somebody else at Leeds who found it, but I was looking at this file recently and forgot about it. And somebody's just casually caught a gun out of the back of the file. I don't know if there's more. I don't know if there's a series and we can, like, it's a sort of treasure hunt for us that are looking at these files, but it's a bit unusual when, I mean, I'm looking at, that was a pension file for a man who'd lost a limb in the First World War, and you just got a Browning automatic at the back. So you will find some strange things, but that is the joys of the archives. And yeah, just go have fun, go look at really cool stuff for your research, because it's the best part of the PhD. Like, I mean, I know Claire said events and stuff, and they are great, but actually get to do the research is, I think, the most fun. Thank you. And obviously I'll answer any questions at the end, because I realize I just rambled a lot about archives.
Well, thank you so much, Louise. That was absolutely fascinating. And I really want to see that gun. Like, that's absolutely crazy. So we'll
I
move
have
on
a lot of questions.
Same here. Move on to the lovely Cynthia.
Yeah, hi. Let me just share my screen really quick. So, all right, can I get like a thumbs up or something? Just awesome. And everyone can hear me okay? All right. Hi, good evening. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Cynthia. I am the other publicity officer alongside Claire, and I'm very honored to have been asked to join this. This is very exciting for me. I'm going to be talking about being organized and digital tools. So this is kind of a massive hobby for me. I say that just so that I could stay sane during this PhD. I am toward the end of my second year, but I also have ADHD, which I think is a superpower in a lot of ways. But that does mean that organization is a priority for me. So I'm just going to be talking about digitally. I think that's what a lot of people use these days. And just a little quick summary about me. I'm at the University of Liverpool, and I am looking at 18th century British women in circles of diplomacy. So lots of archival material, needing to stay organized, things like that. So again, just going to briefly be talking about note-taking, data collecting, brainstorming, writing, referencing systems, saving your work, and here we go. So note-taking. So there's loads of apps out there. I'm sure you've probably tried many as well. Word, classic. Evernote is a good one. Notion is also a very user-friendly platform. And to scan, whether that's documents or archival materials, your notes app on your iPhone or iPad. I know that Apple has that capability. You can scan documents quite. That's also quite helpful. I've been using that in my journeys to the library. Going into Notion a little bit further. So with your university email, you can gain access to premium Notion and their platform for free. So it helps you create lots of workspaces. This is just some screenshots from my Notion. So the first top image is kind of a desktop landing place where I keep my literature, archives, thesis skeleton off of a Zettelkasten method. It is a very old school analog version of kind of note-taking, but putting that in a digital way has been quite helpful. And this lower image grab is from my literature section of my Notion workspace. And, I keep my books, journals, chapters, anything and everything that I need to keep tabs of. I keep that here, and that's been quite helpful. Another big thing is time blocking. So similar to what Claire mentioned, making sure you have a diary, whether that's physical or digital. Time blocking really helps you stay productive. It's, a lot of these are based off the Pomodoro technique. There's digital apps. This first screen grab is an example of one I have on my uni computer. You can also use Google Calendar or any other digital calendar really to help you visualize time blocking. I think that helps a lot. Really grasp what's realistic in your day. The lower screen grab is just an example of, I've done some writing retreats virtually with my university, and that's a day, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. of just focused work, scheduled breaks, and that does help. Alongside, planning, setting a routine, establishing a routine is really helpful during your PhD, especially the earlier part of your PhD. You're still trying to figure out. It's very liberating doing a PhD. It's basically you set your own schedule, but that can also be a little stressful if you don't know where to start. So that's an example. Not to overwork yourself, but to make sure you're staying efficient. So data creation, visualizing it, organizing it. I'm sure you're familiar with Excel. They are incredible for like graphs, spreadsheets. Canva is a very user-friendly platform to also create graphs. Data Wrapper is a free and open source website that I've used, and I'll go into a little bit of depth about that in the next slide. And then there's a couple other QGIS. I don't know, I haven't used these, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, but it's the acronym, and NVivo. So those are just some other helpful platforms. So Data Wrapper, again, some screen grabs from what I've used it for. So you can see I've used it for timelines, creating maps, pie charts, bar graphs, what have you. And you can publish it as well, or edit it however you need to. It's incredible. I would highly recommend, and it's free. So that's helpful for students. Let's see, the next one is brainstorming and writing. So if you're, a visual learner as well, and you're thinking about how best to go about researching, writing, tackling this project, I would recommend talking to your university about what apps and software they have licensing for. So this is an example. My university offers MindView, and it's quite literally mind mapping on your computer. This is an example of, how pretty or in depth you can make it. And you can usually also export these to Word or other writing software. Another one that I will plug, again, I'm not sponsored by any of these. These are just like helpful tricks and tips. Scrivener, I was recommended to this by some supervisors as well. It's an incredible platform. It's hard to describe. You can do almost anything with it. You can write novels, you can write, plays and essays to books. Anyone uses it and everyone uses it often. However, it's similar to Word where you do put your writing in it, but you can also break it down. So rather than having everything on one Word document and you're scrolling through it, you can break it down paragraph by paragraph or page by page, or even sentence by sentence, however nitpicky you're trying to figure out where you want things to go when you start writing. And then the lower screen grab is a feature called like the cork board. So you can, think of it if you have flashcards of quickly, chapter 1 will be this, chapter 2. You can do that digitally and drag and drop, and it makes it really easy to plan, figure things out in a visual way. I would also say, again, check with the university what partnerships and licensing they might have. EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley are very popular ones. I personally use EndNote, so these are just some examples. Again, it's because it's mostly provided by my university. I am most experienced in EndNote, but the top screen grab, I have, almost over 300 sources from my secondary literature, and you can just put everything that you can find about the source into this database. And then in the lower screen grab, it's just a little insert into Word, and it's really easy to plug in for footnotes, referencing, what have you, as you're typing. If that's how you write, it's even for the end, almost to publish that really manuscript. This is really helpful. And then finally, saving your work. I'm sure if you don't have, your own horror stories, you might have heard some from your friends. Saving work is extremely important. But as you're going into this, I would say new adventure, it's going to be years of work that you want to make sure, even if you don't think you'll go back to it, you probably will. Your university most likely has software or agreements that they'll have 20, 30, 50 gigabytes of storage already, whether that's, OneDrive with your email or Dropbox or what have you. So these are just some of the classic ones, just to, having a backup, rather that's email or a hard drive, but having it in some sort of cloud is also extremely helpful. And usually you can work from home and then go into uni and it'll still be there. So those are just some of my tips. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I think even in the 4th year of my PhD, I learned so much from that I should probably take on board. So next we have Darren, who is going to be talking about beginning writing. So we're getting very serious now.
Yes, hello everyone. So I'll just get my screen sharing. Can you all see the PowerPoints? Lovely, colorful, awesome. So yes, hello everyone. My name's Darren. I'm a 3rd-year PhD student at UCL, where I study settler colonialism. And I want to give a couple caveats to this quick talk, that I'm talking from my own experience, as everyone on this panel is. And my experience is I'm doing a 3-year program as an international student who has to get out of here quickly. So you can take that with a grain of salt if you're doing a 4-year program or if you're doing part-time. But a lot of my tips can be extrapolated onto that longer time period. And my other caveat is that we all know how to write, obviously. So I'm not going to condescend and try to tell you how to write, because if you're here, you can write. Instead, I'm just going to give some tips on dealing with the scale of PhD writing, which is probably the newest thing for everyone when we start PhD, is going from writing 10,000 or 30,000 word dissertations to 100,000 words. So I just reflected on my own experience and distilled it into 4 sort of tips to deal with writing at that sort of scale. So my first tip is to set yourself a realistic timeline with your own deadlines that will keep you motivated to write for 3 years straight. So there's a couple reasons why I say that. First of all, because often you're given sort of an institutional deadline. For our school, it was 1 year in. You have to produce 1 chapter after 1 year, and then you upgrade. But I know some students got tricked by that, and all they did in their first year was write 1 chapter. And then all of a sudden they need to write 6 chapters in the next year and a half. Whereas people who started earlier, maybe wrote 2 chapters or 3 chapters in their first year, had a lot less anxiety and stress going on. So that's why I sort of advise you to create your own timelines rather than relying on the institutional timeline. And it also helps you avoid the revision crisis, because if you're having a 3-year or 4-year degree, you can think like, oh, I can write in my last year. You can't write in your last year. You need to have been done writing in your last year and need to be revising for that year. And you can't even write in like the last at least 3 to 5 months, because you have to submit your thesis and then it has to sit in a void for 3 months before you can be defending it. So you don't really have the time in that last year. So plan ahead, set your own sort of deadlines. In which you build revision and submission into your timeline. And I'll give you a little graph of how that worked for me so you can visualize that. And I give 1 tip for creating deadlines here, which is applying for a reasonable amount of conference talks. And it's not to do that to get it on your resume, although that is sort of helpful. They're not as important as publishing. So don't overburden yourself with conferences, but they create deadlines for you that, okay, I applied to present a chapter 8 months from now. Oh, they accepted me. I've got to produce a chapter 8 months from now. And if you do that like 1 to 2, I would say max 3 times a year, then you have those really hard deadlines for yourself to make yourself sit down and start writing instead of thinking about writing. So I'll give you a visualization of what my path looked like. You'll see this is my 36-year path. 6 months I spent working on chapter 1. Then once that happened, it was almost chapter 2. 2 months, 3 months, 2 months, 3 months, 3 months. And then you sort of build in, a couple months of revisions, and then go back to writing for another 2 months. And then now I'm in that 8th month revision session. And then you have a 3-month session for submission where you can't touch it, and then 2-month revision after that. So you don't want to end up in a space where you only have 2 months for revisions at the end. If you thought that, I'll put off my writing until the last year, you'll end up in a sticky situation. So yeah, that's my first tip. Build your own deadlines. And if you know you need to produce something in 2 months, you'll start writing earlier than if you thought you had a whole year to do it. My tip number 2 is avoid hoarding research. So this can get you in a tricky situation in a couple ways. And I kind of call it the uncanny valley of research, where if you have just a little bit of research, you can't write anything good. You need more data. But if you have too much research, you could be paralyzed. You don't know where to start. You have too much, it's overwhelming. So you really should start writing in the middle when you have just enough data that you have some ideas, you think you know an argument you can make. Start writing at that point before you get too much research and you're stuck. You don't know what to do next. And part of that for me was setting deadlines to stop reading, because there's always more research to do. There's always another archive you get to go into. There's always new books that you discovered that, oh, now I need to read this argument. Oh, now I need to read that. You're never going to read it all. You need to set yourself a deadline, say, okay, I'm going to read some historiography for 2 weeks. I'm going to get as much done in 2 weeks, and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to write. Because if you keep trying to finish all the books, you're never going to finish all the books, and you're going to get overwhelmed with too much information. So set yourself those deadlines. And another helpful tip is to write iteratively. And I picked that up from game design pipelines, where you don't sit and you design the game or write a movie. You don't just do it all at once. You do a little bit and you think about it, and then you do it a little bit again, and you add on and you add on and you add on. So you start with, say, 1 paragraph of historiography, and then you stop and write 1 paragraph of primary source research, and then you stop, and then you write a little bit more historiography, and you stop, and you just keep building. That got me into trouble with my first chapter, because I just wrote this huge block of primary source research, and then I had no historiographical reason why it was important, and it was really a struggle. Like, yeah, I spent 4 months writing this, and I don't know what the significance of this is. And it wasn't really significant at all, and I had to rewrite the entire thing. Whereas if I started with the iterative process of a little research, a little historiography, a little research, and then over and over, I would have been saved from writing too much about something that didn't really matter. So that was a good tip for me. And something that I always have to tell myself is strive to finish, strive not to be brilliant, because you can put a lot of pressure on yourself, being like, oh, I have an idea, but it's stupid, or my supervisor is going to look at it and say, no, that's not a very strong analysis. You can write on the second draft a better analysis. Write the shitty draft version first, and then build on it later on. That's my life motto, and I kind of stick to that. And you can take that or leave it with a grain of salt. My third tip is to start with small assignments. And I actually forgot I did this until I went through my emails of how I began my research. I didn't start writing a chapter at a time. I was first started, my supervisor gave me a task. He said, okay, every 2 weeks, I want you to send me an analysis of 3 historical pieces. So 3 relevant books, read them, tell me why they're important, and how are you going to add to them. And so every 2 weeks, I wrote this little paragraph report for my supervisor, which after doing 2 months of that was like almost my introduction historiographical section, just a little bit at a time. And then after that, I didn't start writing whole chapters. I started writing sections of chapters. Like, okay, I'm going to write today 1 case study for 1 chapter. And then after I did that 3 times, I had a chapter all of a sudden, which all of a sudden is like 6 months. But that was sort of the process that led me to start writing bigger chapters, is starting with really small sections and then building up slowly. And my 4th tip this is really about motivation and interest, is do other writing besides your thesis, because 3 years or 4 or 6 is going to drive you crazy if all you ever do is the same topic. So try to find other things to distract yourself or to break up working on your thesis. My favorite is to do book reviews, which are relevant to your topic. Book reviews are fantastic because you get a free book. It forces you to actually read a book from cover to cover and develop a really good understanding of its analysis. And you also get a small little tick on your resume, which, although it's not very important, but ticks are nice. So I do recommend doing some book reviews or do some public engagement work. On your thesis, you're probably going to have to do an impact statement at the very end, saying how you mobilized some of your findings. So do some of that work earlier on. Write some blogs to disseminate your findings, or develop a walking tour if that's what you're into. I like gaming. I wrote a video game based on my research, which was way more fun than writing, and it helped break up my day. So consider doing some public engagement work to keep yourself motivated and prevent burnout. And my last advice would be to write journal articles. That is my last advice, because you have to be strategic. If you want to publish your thesis as a book, you don't want to have published too much of it as articles, because publishers don't like that. But also, if you publish everything that you find that doesn't end up in your thesis, you can't add it to your thesis at the end to revise your thesis for a book, because publishers also want to see revisions to your book. So hold back some things for the book and hold back some things to add to the book. But if there's something else that pops up, then definitely try writing a couple journal articles. But that's the main reflections I had based on my experience, and I'll leave it at those 4 tips. I hope those are helpful.
Thank you so much, Darren. That's so interesting. And I can see that Christina's just put a link in the chat to your fantastic game as well. So everyone can head over and have a look at that. So the last talk that we've got today is probably quite apt to have at the end. So it leaves us all very positive, and we'll be hearing from Amy on imposter syndrome. So whenever you're ready.
Yep, I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Everyone good? Grand. Yeah, so as Claire said, this goes at the end for a reason. So I'm Amy. I'm one of the seminar conveners for History Lab, but I have also previously been a postgraduate support administrator at Sheffield Hallam. So this is kind of based on a session I used to run with them at the very end of their inductions. So what is imposter syndrome? Imposter syndrome is when someone disregards their own achievements, telling themselves that they aren't good enough. When someone has imposter syndrome, they struggle to see or acknowledge their own capabilities, and they struggle with pressure and personal expectations. Now, statistics suggest that at least 70% of people will identify as having imposter syndrome at least some point in their lives and careers. So it's really likely that most of us in this room have, do, or will at some point have these feelings. And it's also really common in postgraduate students. But hopefully the statistic and the little picture on the screen, instead of being scary, is reassuring, because if you're experiencing it, you're not alone. So imposter syndrome can manifest itself in all sorts of questioning thoughts and worries that spiral around inside your mind. So common imposter syndrome thoughts can include: my success is due to luck, I don't belong here, and I'm not as capable as they think I am. So I asked my PhD cohort what words they would think about when they were feeling like the imposter. And despite their really different ages and their different research interests and backgrounds, they all had really similar words. So words like inferior, incapable, unworthy, that they lacked confidence. And the last one, that the feeling that everybody is suffering from imposter syndrome, but you feel like the real imposter. And that's a very common one. So what is the impact of imposter syndrome? So if you have imposter syndrome, you may struggle to accept praise and recognition, believing that the person giving the feedback thinks you've done more than you have, or that they've missed something that you didn't do well. You might obsess over mistakes and failures. Even those mistakes that are small can actually cause a really overwhelming sense of imposter syndrome and anxiety. You might hold back, stopping yourself getting involved in a project, for example, because you feel everyone else involved is more qualified than you are. You might procrastinate, subconsciously feeling that if you don't do it, you can't get anything wrong. People with imposter syndrome often only judge themselves by the highest standards. So the slack you might cut some of your friends, you won't cut yourself. And lastly, you might be afraid that someone will find out, discovering that you don't belong and that they'll ask you to leave, which in turn can again lead you to holding back in fear of saying the wrong thing that might expose you. So how can we cope with imposter syndrome? So I'm just going to kind of go through a few different coping strategies, and hopefully some of them will be helpful. So first up is identifying those feelings and sharing them. So this is so important because you can't start helping yourself if you haven't identified how you're feeling. And sharing them with other people, as I said, can really massively help because you'll realize that you're not alone in that situation. Sometimes imposter syndrome can be so intense that you need to seek professional help, and that is completely fine. But when you first recognize it or have short periods of it, speaking to your supervisors and fellow students can be really beneficial. And literally one of the best days for me was when I was having a little bit of a wobble, and my supervisors said to me, we still feel like the imposters and we've been academics for the last like 25 years. And that was just the most terrifying and amazing moment for me. So one of the great things to try to do is to build a PhD community around yourself. And that might feel a bit daunting right now, and it can take a bit of time, but having a group of friends that are also experiencing research life and PhD life is incredibly important, especially if you're finding that like your current group of friends or family don't really understand. It can be really useful to have people who are kind of along for the ride with you. So your friends and supervisors can also help you recognize your achievements when you don't think there have been any. So again, quite often if I'm having a little wobble, one of my friends or my partner will just sit me down and be like, don't you remember all these great things that have happened in the last year that you didn't know last year were going to happen? And that's quite reassuring and can kind of help you get back on track. So another coping method is to change how you talk about yourself and your goals. So using words such as should, must, have to, and will can have a really negative effect because these are hard and movable words that place you under a lot of pressure. So instead, try using words like would be good if, or would like to, have the opportunity to, or will try to. So when you're sitting down with your supervisors, for example, and you're creating goals for your next year, instead of saying, I must attend a conference and I will have my paper published afterwards, say something along the lines of, I'd like to attend this conference, and if there's an opportunity, it would be good if I could publish my paper. Because those flexible, open-ended words help you create new thinking patterns, and that alleviates the pressure. So that's a really useful one. And you'll even see that kind of in the everyday conversations that you have with your research PhD community, that sometimes you'll all be talking in words that you realize are just unnecessarily putting pressure on yourself and each other, and you can change that. So another useful thing to do is to understand how you perceive failure and to reevaluate what that actually means to you. So this one can take a bit of time, and it can take more time to process your emotions when something doesn't go to plan. But when this does happen, try to think about the practical and personal benefits and value of that experience. So for example, earlier on, I think Darren mentioned the upgrade. So I didn't pass my upgrade first time round, which was a surprise for everybody. But actually, after working on the resubmission, I could really happily recognize that the project has like developed and is much stronger, and I'm much happier with it because of that challenge. And obviously I had to go through an emotional process to get there, but it was really, really helpful to kind of reevaluate what I thought about that failure. So things not going to plan are not failures. They're stepping stones and lessons that are a really valuable part of your PhD. And a PhD is an organic process. So again, I think Claire mentioned this earlier, it won't look the same as what you thought it would at the beginning. And that's entirely fine. And how those things develop can come up nicely and naturally, or can come quite scarily. And that's when having that community and being ready to speak to people is really important. So as well, avoid comparing yourself to others. This is counterproductive for us all, and a lot of us really do it without realizing. And when you see yourself doing it, this is a really good time to just take a step back on your own for a moment, and just remind yourself, firstly, of all the things you have done, all the things you have achieved, and your abilities and skills, but also just to remind yourself that everyone is experiencing it differently. So everyone has their own personal and professional stresses. And although people experience the PhD in different ways, a lot of them will have felt like the imposter at some point. So, you know, it's fine. So sometimes you might need to remind yourself that your research and passion is valid and real. And it's also really important to know and to not worry that there are differences in the application of research. And that's totally fine. So it's also okay not to love your PhD every day. We all have bad days, and we all naturally find some aspects of our research more exciting, more engaging, and easier than others. And kind of going back to that organization we were chatting about earlier, that can be when actually blocking things into different sections can be really helpful, so that you're not just getting into this headspace where you're looking at the thing you really hate for 3 weeks and then thinking, what am I doing with my life? I promise you'll feel much better if you interdisperse that with other things that you prefer and are more excited by. Again, a PhD is an ongoing process, and you will know more in a few months' time than you do now. But you might feel like you don't, because you've forgotten that you had to learn those original things. So everyone was chatting about paleography earlier, and I didn't know that that was something I needed to do before my PhD. And now it's just like, oh, this is fine. But I had to learn that, and now it just seems a lot more simple. And the organic nature of your PhD in that way, it doesn't devalue who you are now or what you're doing in this moment or any other moment, because you are just creating all the building blocks that make your whole PhD future. So finally, this is something one of my friends said to me, it really stuck with me, that at times you will know that these feelings of being the imposter and of anxiety and things, you'll know they're irrational, but that doesn't mean they're not real. They're still very real, and you still, if you're struggling, please, please, please reach out to your fellow students, your supervisors, NHS wellbeing services, your institute support staff. Like someone said earlier, again, a lot of admin staff have actually done PhDs or are doing PhDs. So I used to get a lot of people come to me for this pastoral support because they knew I understood. And so don't be afraid to tell someone how you're feeling. It will be the first step in feeling better about it. So that's it, really. Thank you so much for joining me.